So we're just kind of right on the tipping point of summer here. Quilt Sunday, we're kind of finishing up the year, but as the church year goes, we're also tipping into a new time of the year as well. I wouldn't say a season. If you see us up front in green, we're by definition not in a season. We're just kind of floating around loose between seasons. When we move into this time of year, though, we're starting an entire second half of the story of this year. So the story of the year begins around the time of Thanksgiving. We celebrate and observe the season of Advent. We get to Christmas, we get to Epiphany, we move to Ash Wednesday and Lent and Holy Week and Easter, and a week of weeks celebrating Easter. And then as we move past Easter, this whole first part of the year, the story of the life of Jesus and Jesus' earthly ministry, his birth, his crucifixion, all of these steps we move through. And now we shift gears into a different time of year. The second half of the year is not about Jesus, it's about us. But it can be a little confusing because every Sunday we'll still tell stories about Jesus. So it's not always obvious, but it's the time of year that is about us. It's the time of year where Jesus is telling us how we should be living this life. Or maybe a different way of saying it, it's the time of year where we walk out to the car after the service going, I don't know about that Jesus guy. He's got a lot to say about what I'm supposed to be about, and I'm not totally sure I'm totally on board. We're in that part of the year. And certainly today's reading is kind of a piece of that story. In today's story, we hear a lot about the Sabbath. And there will be a lot of sermons preached today about this idea of rest, of recreation, recreation, this idea of renewing ourselves. But at the same time, we're going to see in the text today that there are some different ways in which this moves. I think it could be argued, I've read a lot recently about community and individuals. Our society, in a lot of ways, is kind of at the pendulum end of the individual focus in regards to society. If we move to the other end towards community, that's a different focus. Both ends have amazing blessings and both ends have challenges at times. And throughout the centuries, human society kind of slowly moves from one end to the other, and we are definitely towards an end, a piece of focus on individual. And when we think of Sabbath, then, we might think of it individually. Did I get time away? Did I get this, that, or the other? This idea of a time of rest, and that's important. But the history of Sabbath is something that is often understood to be observed in community. It's a time in which we gather. I would guess for many of you, this is probably the largest grouping of people you will be around this week. And this is a common piece of the way in which we observe Sabbath. We begin by gathering for worship. Now, certainly, if we go back to the Old Testament texts, if we think of the Jewish people in particular, the idea of the observance of Sabbath has different connotations, but has been an important part of their identity as a people. It's an important part of who they are. But the funny thing about today's reading from the gospel is that this isn't some story about the disciples being overworked and tired, and Jesus comes and says, hey guys, I really think we need to take a day off and take a break. That's not the story that we have today. In fact, the second part of the gospel text, in many ways, is calling us to make a list of the reasons why we might not observe Sabbath time. It's kind of a curious set of readings there. Jesus and his disciples had been moving through this field. They were hungry. They were taking grain from the stalks. They were eating it. They weren't supposed to be doing that on the Sabbath. It was something that they were to abstain from work, and there they were working by harvesting this grain, even in small pieces like this. Now, this idea of work on the Sabbath is something that the religious leaders of Jesus' day paid very close attention to in the hopes of tripping him up in some fashion. So in the second half of the story, we see that Jesus shows up at the synagogue, and there is this action-packed piece where you can picture in the back, there are all these Pharisees with like clipboards, and they've got their cell phones out ready to record Jesus so that they can take it back to the leadership and say, aha, we caught him red-handed helping people. This guy's got to be stopped. Helping people on the Sabbath, helping this man who had a withered hand. Now, there's a lot of things that are interesting in this story. For one, Jesus shows a lot of emotion. It's translated as him being angry, but an argument could be made to say that he was enraged. Enraged. We get a bit uncomfortable when Jesus starts showing a lot of emotion. We can think of the scene where Jesus wept at the death of his beloved friend Lazarus. Or we can think of that time when he was in the temple and he made a whip and drove people out, kicking tables over. We kind of like Jesus when he's calmer, right? Usually our image is he's kind of just slightly out of focus. He's got a bizarrely white robe for the first century, surely not possible, a kind of a blue sash and really great hair, and he walks around kind of slowly, and as always, there are lambs everywhere he goes, right? Is kind of the picture we have. And this idea of rage as a part of what's happening. What is that rage about? The hurt and pain of this man, and Jesus knowing that he is in a position to do something about it, except for that it's the Sabbath. Now, we could say that Jesus was stuck, right? Shoot, I'd help you, but it's the Sabbath. I mean, we're kind of trapped, right? He could have responded that way. The text talking about a withered hand would suggest that that wasn't a condition that man had woken up with that day. Likely he had had a withered hand for quite some time, had learned to live with it, such that Jesus might have approached him, maybe during the sharing of the peace and said, hey, meet me after the service at Pete's, and I'll sort this out for you. Or, hey, we're leaving town tomorrow. How about we meet just outside of town before I head out? I'll wait for you there, and I'll heal your hand then. Seems reasonable workaround. Except Jesus, seeing all the clipboards and the phones out in the back, says, is everyone watching? I'm about to heal this man on the Sabbath. He was not subtle about it. Kind of makes you wonder if he would have done it if there weren't people watching, right? This sense of being angry about the brokenness of this world, and particularly for those who are vulnerable or who may be on the margins, or whatever the case might be. And what's interesting is how angry they get afterwards. That's it. He helped this guy on the Sabbath. Something has got to be done. Now, in our world, just like in any point in history, There are certain groups that are vulnerable and hurting and in pain in our world, and we wrestle with how to help. And is it the right time or is it not? How does this work? I was reading an article this last week about Catholic Charities in San Diego who assist with those who are in the country illegally and new. And one of the things that they're wrestling with right now is threats coming to staff and others working in that ministry. Or we think of this month as Pride Month and all of the FBI warnings that come with that for people's safety. All kinds of situations. But one of the things that I notice when Jesus says, we're going to heal this guy right now, Jesus is giving us a model for how we are to move through this life. So I told you at the beginning, this half of the year is about how we are called to live, right? Jesus is going to heal this man, and every one of us in our own brokenness struggles because we want to put footnotes to this. Oh, that guy? Oh, you want to heal that guy? Not that guy. We want footnotes, right? We want to make sure that we're not accidentally in a position where we might help somebody who shouldn't have been helped, right? And each and every one of us, myself included, there's maybe a different list of people that is our list of folks who shouldn't be helped because of X, Y, or Z. But you know, Jesus, I think, would speak to us and say, it's pretty simple. I didn't ask you to put footnotes. It just really is help. Help. And I would suggest that in every kind of faith community, every different kind of thought persuasion, whatever the case is, we all have lists of folks that we just don't want to help. And I think Jesus is saying in this text about the Sabbath, there are people who need help before you're concerned about whether they're worthy about it or not. There are people that need your assistance regardless of whether you thought they could do more to help themselves first. And in the midst of that, we should make every effort to start our Sabbath together, dusting ourselves off to continue that helping work, to be fed in the meal at the altar, that we might go out with good courage and take the risk that we might help someone who maybe didn't deserve it. Is that not the risk that Jesus calls us to be about in this life? Amen.